Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm David Dodick. I chair the American Brain Foundation's board. The American Brain Foundation funds research, as you know, across the entire spectrum of brain diseases because we believe that many of them are interconnected, and curing one disease may mean we'll be able to cure many. So relevant to this evening's topic, we're actually funding two Parkinson's disease researchers who are receiving grants from the American Brain Foundation to look into the role of dopamine, as you'll hear a little bit more about this evening, in pain processing, and in particular, how a particular gene mutation influences that. We're also recently funded studies looking into improving dysphagia or difficulty swallowing and discover biomarkers to monitor the progression of Parkinson's disease. We also issued a multi-year Cure One, Cure Many $3 million research grant to a group of researchers in the United States who are working to identify a diagnostic test or biomarker for Lewy body disease, which is a closely related disease to Parkinson's disease. And so tonight we will discuss a topic that has been, I think, in the national and global spotlight recently, and that is environmental toxins and brain disease. And our special guest speaker tonight, who is a renowned expert on Parkinson's disease, will focus his comments to a large extent on Parkinson's disease. But globally, disability and death due to Parkinson's disease are increasing faster than for any other neurological disorder. In fact, in the past 25 years, the prevalence of Parkinson's disease has doubled, will double again by 2040, and disability from Parkinson's disease has increased by 80%, and the deaths have increased by 100%. So really quite a rapidly progressive incidence of disease. And so the question is, well, why is this? And one factor may lie in the ubiquitous and pervasive nature of harmful environmental toxins and their effect on the brain. These include things from pesticides to paint removers to gun cleaners to aerosol cleaning products, and even chemicals that use to dry clean our clothes. And so today's discussion will be centered around the risks of environmental toxins on the brain in general and regarding Parkinson's disease in particular. And I'm really delighted to welcome our guest speaker tonight, Dr. Ray Dorsey. Dr. Dorsey is the David M. Levy Professor of Neurology, and he's the director of the Center for Health and Technology at the University of Rochester Medical Center. He is working to identify and eliminate the root causes of Parkinson's disease. He's the co-author of Ending Parkinson's Disease, which is an indispensable guide for patients and their families, as well as for clinicians, scientists, politicians, and activists. For the past decade, Dr. Dorsey has used telemedicine to improve care for individuals with Parkinson's disease, and his research has been published widely in the leading neurology, medical, and economic journals, and has been featured on a wide variety of news and media outlets, including NPR, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times. And previously, Dr. Dorsey directed the Parkinson's Disease Division at Johns Hopkins Medicine, and he's consulted for McKinsey and Company. So Dr. Dorsey, it's a real pleasure and an honor to have you here tonight, and we're looking forward to your comments.
Delighted to be with you, Dr. Dodick. It's delighted to be with Jane Ransom with the American Academy of Neurology, which funded me as a clinical research training fellow recipient 15 years ago, and delighted to be part of the American Brain Foundation discussion this evening. My apologies for any of you who joined last time, and I was unable to make it with some technical difficulties, which were especially challenging given that I do a lot of telemedicine, so I was kind of embarrassed about it all. So I think you can see my screen okay. So I'm going to talk to you about the environmental toxins that are associated with Parkinson's disease, but these toxins aren't just limited to Parkinson's disease. They likely apply to other brain diseases, especially Alzheimer's disease and ALS. They're also really important when we think about looking for a cure. So many of you are probably looking for a cure for Parkinson's disease or a cure for Alzheimer's disease or a cure for ALS. And I'd submit to you, if we don't know what the cause of a disease is, it's really, really, really hard to cure it. In fact, I can think of very few medical conditions that we can cure medically where we don't know what its cause is. And I think it's really important to think about what the cause of diseases are, because one, you can prevent other people from getting the disease, 2, you may be able to slow the progression of people who already have the disease by minimizing exposure to those ongoing toxicants. And 3, if we know what the cause of the disease is, it'd be much, much, much easier to find out effective treatments for it. And then final little prelude is my American Academy of Neurology Clinical Research Training Fellowship was focused on looking at the financing for biomedical research, especially for neurological diseases. And the reason you probably hear very little about the preventable nature of Parkinson's disease, very little about the environmental toxicants that are likely fueling the rise of Parkinson's, ALS, and Alzheimer's disease is because only 2 cents out of every Parkinson's research dollar is dedicated to preventing the disease. Only 2 cents of every Parkinson's research dollar is dedicated to preventing the disease. As many of you know, the principal funder of biomedical research is the pharmaceutical industry, which, if anything, benefits from more people getting the disease. And they're focused on developing new treatments, but that's where 60% of the dollars go. Even foundations are often run by people who are most directly affected by the disease, and they rightly have an interest in trying to come up with better treatments. And so it leaves only a small proportion of federal funding that's aimed at preventing the disease, which I actually think is the greatest gift that we neurologists can give, is to give future generations a world where Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, ALS are increasingly rare, not increasingly common. So with that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the rise of Parkinson's disease, argue that Parkinson's disease is largely a man-made disease, and then conclude that Parkinson's disease is preventable. Parkinson's disease is a preventable disease. There's no reason that the vast majority of individuals who have the disease need be suffering what Dr. Dodick rightly described as the world's fastest growing brain disease. So first, the rise of Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease was once rare and was once likely extraordinarily rare. It was so rare that it caught the eye of a 61-year-old surgeon in London, England in 1817, Dr. James Parkinson. And he said, he wrote an essay on 6 people that he observed with this new disease. He says that it was a disease that had not been classified in the medical literature, a disease that had not been classified in medical literature. He went to great lengths to describe that, how tremor had long been described, but this disease associated with tremor, a stooped posture, a shuffling gait, a tendency to walk forward faster and faster and to fall over was new. And Dr. Parkinson described this condition at the height of the Industrial Revolution and in the capital of the Industrial Revolution, London. And I don't think that was a coincidence. And I'll come talk a little bit more about the extent of air pollution in London in 1800, but there's a picture of London in 1847 where you can't even see across the street, air pollution is so bad. And as Dr. Dodick indicated, Parkinson's disease is the world's fastest growing brain disease according to the Global Burden of Disease study. And if you look at the map of prevalence of Parkinson's disease, you'll notice a couple things. One, there's a 5-fold variation in the prevalence of Parkinson's disease adjusted for age, a 5-fold variation in the prevalence of Parkinson's disease adjusted for age, suggesting that it's unlikely there are 5-fold differences in genetic differences among populations by region, but environmental factors certainly can vary that much. Second is you'll notice that the areas of the world that are most industrialized, like the United States and Canada, have the highest rates of Parkinson's disease, while the areas of the world that are least industrialized, like sub-Saharan Africa, have the lowest rates of the disease. And finally, what you can't see here is areas of the world that are undergoing the most rapid industrialization, like China and India, have the fastest increasing rates of Parkinson's disease. I'm not going to argue that Parkinson's disease is largely a man-made disease. And what do I mean by man-made? Man-made means that but for the inventions of humans, especially men, Parkinson's disease would be extraordinarily rare. And the poster child for man-made diseases is lung cancer. And if you look at this graph, 100 years ago, lung cancer in the United States essentially didn't exist. If you look at the black line, lung cancer deaths due to lung cancer in the United States in the 1920s was essentially zero. It was so rare, it was considered by doctors to be a once-in-a-lifetime oddity. All the doctors and medical students would gather around when they saw a case thinking they would never see one again. However, unfortunately, rates of lung cancer rose 25 years after the introduction of cigarettes into the United States in the early 1900s. You see a corresponding rise in lung cancer deaths among men in the United States. And then one of the great public health achievements of the last 50 years has been a decline in smoking. And when you see smoking rates decline in the 1970s, you see 25 years later a corresponding decline in lung cancer deaths. What about the genetics of Parkinson's disease? It turns out that Parkinson's disease, as like most neurodegenerative diseases, the heritability of the disease is actually quite low. This is research from a paper from Nature Review Genetics, and with some help from Dr. Bas Bloom, my colleague, who put these in order. And you can see that the heritability of certain conditions like schizophrenia is really high. It has a strong tendency to run in families, but diseases like Parkinson's do not. In fact, only about 15% of people with Parkinson's have a family history of the disease, and only about 15% of people with Parkinson's have an identifiable genetic risk factor. And most of those risk factors have an incomplete penetrance, meaning that the most people who carry those genetic risk factors will not go on to develop Parkinson's disease. So what is causing Parkinson's disease? So this is the money slide. These are the three, in my mind, the three most likely causes of Parkinson's disease. We need more evidence to make that statement, substantiate this statement, but I think these are the three factors that are likely contributing to the rise of Parkinson's disease. And they are: one, air pollution; two, certain pesticides, and we'll talk a little, focus on a pesticide called paraquat; and three, these dry cleaning chemicals, best which have known is trichloroethylene, as Dr. Dodick alluded to at the outset. And if you look at the comments on each one of these environmental toxins, they're largely getting increasingly common, not decreasing their use, especially when you look outside of Western Europe, which has largely had reductions in air pollution, reductions in pesticides, reductions in the use of these dangerous chemicals. But most of the rest of the world is seeing increasing use of these environmental toxins, or increasing exposure to these environmental toxins. So I'm going to go through each one. So first, what's the story on air pollution? So air pollution, many of you have seen The Crown, the TV series The Crown, and saw the Great Smog in 1952, toward the end of Winston Churchill's last term as Prime Minister. Great Smog in 1952 killed 12,000 people in London, led to mass hospitalizations, and led to the first Clean Air Act in modern history approximately 3 years later. But if you look at the air pollution in 1950 London, it's about half as bad it was in 1800 London. So 1800 London had levels of particulate matter, little pieces of dirt and soot suspended in the air, a level of 400 micrograms per cubic meter, which is about what air pollution is in Delhi, India, and the most polluted parts of the world today. So I think what Dr. Parkinson's was seeing in 1800 London was clearly air pollution. I think he was seeing the chronic effects of exposure to air pollution, which you can see began in the decades before Dr. Parkinson's seminal description of the disease. Unfortunately, you don't have to go to 1800 London to see air pollution. Those of you in the Northeast, like me, experienced lots of air pollution from Canadian wildfires. In fact, air pollution in New York City this summer reached the levels of 1800 London. In fact, air quality in New York City was about the worst it was anywhere in the world. Last Tuesday, when I was supposed to give my lecture, I bike to work every day, or when I can. And it was, we had bad air quality in Rochester, New York, which normally has beautiful blue skies in the summer. You can see there's a lot of haze in the air. As a good neurologist, I'm wearing a helmet when I bike, but I prefer not to be wearing an N95 mask when bicycling. So that's air pollution. What about pesticides? So in 1980s, the first environmental toxicant linked to Parkinson's or Parkinsonism was described in Northern California, and it was due to a contaminant in the production of heroin called MPTP. A pesticide called paraquat has a near identical chemical structure to MPTP, and research done by Dr. Caroline Tanner and others, Bill Langston, have demonstrated that individuals exposed to paraquat have a 150% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. Paraquat's considered the most toxic weed killer ever developed. It kills the weeds that Roundup doesn't. It's so dangerous that it's been used to commit homicide and suicide. In over 30 countries, including China, have banned the chemical, but the United States has not. In fact, you can see that paraquat is sprayed on farms throughout the United States. It's being sprayed on farms today, likely in Western New York, likely 20, 30 minutes from where I'm sitting right now. Use of paraquat in the United States has actually more than doubled in the last 5 years, for which data are available despite its known risks. And a great expose written by the British investigative newspaper The Guardian last October revealed that the manufacturers of paraquat, according to The Guardian, knew about its risks of paraquat and hid them from the public. They also sought to discredit one of my colleagues, a researcher who 25 years ago demonstrated that when you expose laboratory animals to paraquat, they develop the pathological features of Parkinson's disease. Well, I'll give you some of the highlights. I'm happy to discuss this further. As early as 1960s, the company, according to The Guardian, found that large doses of paraquat in some rats and mice resulted in a stiff gait or tremors. So over 50 years ago, the company knew that its weed killer produced the features of Parkinson's disease in laboratory animals. This didn't lead the company to withdraw the product from the market. This didn't lead the company to introduce a safer alternative. Rather, according to The Guardian, the company doubled down on its blockbuster product. In 1974, regulators were concerned about workers, quote, who might inadvertently lick small quantities of paraquat residue off their lips or inhale paraquat mist. And almost 50 years ago, rumors were circulating that some in the EPA favored banning paraquat. But despite that, the product remained on the market. And an internal company memo was concerned about a scientific article from the 1980s, which showed a near perfect correlation of 0.967. One would be a perfect correlation between levels of pesticide use and Parkinson's cases in rural areas of Canada. The internal memo warns that paraquat could become a huge liability like asbestos and says that Parkinson's can go on for decades. And indeed, it has. If these actions sound familiar, they should, because they mimic what the tobacco industry did with cigarettes, which we saw that lung cancer was a man-made disease, largely didn't exist, extraordinarily rare. In 1900, I think there were 140 case reports of lung cancer in the world's literature. Today, lung cancer is the leading cause of cancer death, both in the United States and around the world. And science at its best is dedicated to the production of knowledge, ideally for the benefit of the public. These actions by these companies are dedicated to the production of ignorance, often for commercial gain. And a new word was coined in 1992 to describe this production of ignorance, and it's called agnotology. And it's illustrated by tobacco companies who adopted a campaign focused on sowing the seeds of doubt about the harmful effects of their products. And you can think about the same thing being applied to climate change, to gun violence, and to air pollution, and to a wide range of toxicants. And if this is being applied by one company to one pesticide linked to Parkinson's disease, it begs the question, what are other companies doing with other toxicants that are contributing to brain disease? The last one I'm going to talk about is this chemical called trichloroethylene. And if you're like me, you had no idea that trichloroethylene, or TCE, even existed. When I was beginning to write our book, Ending Parkinson's, my colleague, Dr. Caroline Tanner, who's just an extraordinarily talented researcher, introduced me to this chemical. It's a really, really simple chemical. It's got a whopping 6 atoms. And most of you know that H2O, or water, has 3 atoms. Trichloroethylene has 6. It's got 2 carbon atoms, 1 hydrogen, and 3 chlorine atoms, hence its name trichloroethylene. And a closely related dry cleaning chemical called perchloroethylene is identical, except instead of the 1 hydrogen atom, it has a 4th chlorine atom. And this chemical has been used in everything from decaffeinating coffee to degreasing metals to dry cleaning clothes. And in the 1970s, 2 pounds per American were produced of this chemical. In the 1980s, 1/3 of American cities had TCE in its groundwater. And research done by Dr. Sam Goldman and again, Dr. Caroline Tanner over 10 years ago found that twins who either had exposure to this chemical through their work or through their hobbies had a 500% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And like smoking and lung cancer, they showed in that study that you don't get exposed to the chemical and develop Parkinson's disease the next day, but there's a lag, and there in that study, an estimated 10 to 40-year lag between exposure to the chemical and diagnosis of Parkinson's disease. And their conclusion in the Annals of Neurology was that because of the widespread use of trichloroethylene and perchloroethylene, that the potential public health implications are substantial, and I think that might be an understatement. Beyond its risk associated with Parkinson's disease, TCE causes cancer. It causes cancer like nobody's business. Any of you who remember or saw the movie A Civil Action, or maybe some attorneys saw this, was due to TCE contaminating the groundwater in Woburn, Massachusetts, leading kids to develop leukemia. The same thing happened in Toms River, New Jersey, and the EPA, the World Health Organization, and the Department of Health and Human Services have all concluded that TCE causes cancer, especially linked to liver, kidney cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, prostate cancer, and multiple myeloma. And it was everywhere. It's estimated that 10 million Americans worked with the chemical. It's estimated that 1 in 12 workers in the United Kingdom, 1 in 12 workers, that's like saying everyone in retail who equivalent to that proportion worked with TCE. And you can see that it was aircraft, jet engine mechanics, dry cleaners, embalmers, painters, printers, shoemakers, taxidermists, weapons specialists, and varnish workers all worked with TCE. It was found in everything from carpet cleaners to gun cleaners, and it's had a wide range of industrial and military uses. So common was TCE that doctors even use it as an analgesic. This is an article from a quote from Dr. Flowers from a prominent obstetrics and gynecology journal in 1956, in which he says trichloroethylene is a potent analgesic drug. Its margin of safety and ease of administration will ultimately make it a standard agent on all delivery floors. Trilene's wide variety of uses will probably allow almost every obstetrician to find a place for it in his obstetrical practice. And indeed, it was widely used as an analgesic agent for pregnant women until the FDA banned that use in 1977. But even if you weren't a pregnant woman, even if you weren't an anesthesiologist, even if you weren't a mechanic working with TCE, you could have been exposed and could have been exposed and could still be being exposed to TCE either in the water you're drinking, especially if you're drinking water from a well in a suburban or urban area, or in the air you breathe. That's because TCE contaminates up to 30% of groundwater in the United States. Up to 30% of groundwater in the United States is contaminated with this chemical because it either leaks from pipes or companies, dry cleaners inappropriately dispose of, sometimes just simply dumping it into the ground. And it forms underground plumes that can migrate a mile or more. Think about groundwaters, maybe depending on where you live, 15 to 50 feet below the ground. And once contaminated, it can migrate. And then from these underground plumes, TCE, much like radon can evaporate from soil and enter people's homes and cause lung cancer, TCE can evaporate from groundwater, enter people's homes, schools, and workplaces and cause cancer and likely increase your risk of developing Parkinson's disease. And TCE is most notoriously for being the principal contaminant at the U.S. Marine base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina, where TCE contaminated the groundwater from 1953 to 1987, exposing 1 million Marines, their dependents, and civilians to this chemical. And the Marines knew about it for the last years of this exposure and did nothing about it. So the Marine Corps knowingly exposed their own servicemen and women to this chemical in the drinking water at one of the principal training bases in the United States. Research done by Dr. Sam Goldman and Caroline Tanner earlier this year showed that Marines who served at Camp Lejeune had a 70% increased risk of developing Parkinson's disease. It's important to remember that these Marines were, one, healthy, two, on average, young. They were 20 years old when they were at Camp Lejeune. Three, the duration of exposure was relatively short, on average only 25 months or 2 years. And then 30 years later, consistent with that previous twin study, they're being diagnosed with Parkinson's disease at rates 70% higher than Marines who served at Camp Pendleton on the West Coast. And these contaminated sites are everywhere. Michigan's estimated to have thousands of these sites. There are in Rochester, New York, mid-sized city, there are 12 dry cleaning sites identified by the State Department of Environmental Conservation that are contaminated. On a 3-mile stretch of a road that's right near where I live, there are 4 state Superfund sites contaminated with TCE. And my guess is that there are sites that are contaminated near where most of you live. This is a picture of a site that was contaminated from an automobile manufacturer in Michigan, showing how TCE gets into the groundwater and forms an underground plume that can be, I think in this case, 2.5 miles in length. So if you live, work, or your kids study on schools that are on top of this underground plume, they could be breathing in these chemicals and not even know about it. Some of you probably live on Long Island. There is a huge 2x4 million underground plume on Long Island from a military contractor that's been contaminated with TCE. This leads to my last point, that Parkinson's is a preventable disease. And so why do I say that? Well, if it's due to environmental factors, these that humans created, then humans can certainly end it. And there's only one high quality study that I'm aware of that showed a decreasing incidence of Parkinson's disease, and that's a study done in Rotterdam in the Netherlands, in which they found over a relatively short period of time a 60% decrease in the incidence of Parkinson's disease. And they didn't have a good reason why that was. So I went back and I looked and I said, well, what happened to air pollution, pesticides, and TCE in the years or decades leading up to this decrease in the incidence of Parkinson's disease? Obviously, this isn't the way you would do research, so this is hypothesis generating, not proof. But if you look at the levels of air pollution, if you look at the levels of pesticides, if you look at the levels of TCE, they all drop significantly in the years or decades prior to this decline in the rates of Parkinson's disease. For example, levels of DDT, which was the pesticide that was the subject of Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring, and their metabolites dropped in fat between 75 and 90% in just a span of 18 years. TCE levels in the Netherlands were among the lowest in all of Europe, and many Western European nations have banned TCE. The United States has not, even though it's found that TCE and PCE both pose a, quote, unreasonable risk to human health. And I said at the outset, we can create a world where Parkinson's is increasingly rare instead of increasingly common. And if we look at what we've done in the past, there's great precedence for us creating a world where diseases are essentially eliminated. Many of you will remember the March of Dimes, which was created in 1938 when Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then the US president, was known to have polio, likely have polio. And a March of Dimes raised millions of dollars. 17 years after the March of Dimes began, Jonas Salk in Pittsburgh, not too far from where I'm sitting now, developed the first vaccine for polio. And today we live in a world where that is largely free of polio. In 1980, a 12 or 13-year-old girl was killed by an automobile driver who was found to be drunk, had been found to have engaged in drinking and driving a week before he killed this 12-year-old girl. And 4 days after the mother of that girl was killed, she started a campaign that became the march, that became Mothers Against Drunk Driving. And in just 8 years, MAD, a group of ordinary citizens, like people listening to this lecture right now, changed the course of drinking and driving. They made it, in 1980, it wasn't illegal in all 50 states, if you can believe that. In 1988, drinking and driving was illegal in all 50 states. Drinking age was raised in the US from 18 to 21, and the threshold for drinking and driving for blood alcohol level was reduced to 0.08 in all states. And today, drinking and driving is socially unacceptable, all because of the heroism of some mothers who suffered unspeakable harm and deaths to their children. 7 years later, we were confronted with a uniformly fatal and unknown virus that was killing men in San Francisco and in New York, and a group of men, in the absence of really any significant federal response, formed an organization led by the late Larry Kramer called ACT UP. And the motto of that organization was silence equals death, because silence did equal death for gay men in New York City and in San Francisco. And the span of a really short period of time, they changed the course of HIV. They barricaded themselves on the streets of New York. They overtook the FDA. They overtook pharmaceutical companies. They overtook the New York Stock Exchange. And 8 years after ACT UP is formed, protease inhibitors were created. And now individuals with HIV have a near normal life expectancy, and rates of HIV are now decreasing, not increasing. And it's quite conceivable, if not likely, that in our lifetime, knock on wood, that HIV will disappear as a major clinical entity from the world. And if we can do these things for polio, if we can do these things for drinking and driving, if we can do these things for HIV and AIDS, we should wonder and ask why we aren't doing exactly the same thing for Parkinson's. Why aren't we doing exactly the same thing for ALS, which is tied to pesticides and head trauma? And why aren't we doing the same thing for Alzheimer's disease, which is tied to air pollution? So Parkinson's and many likely other neurodegenerative brain conditions are fundamentally preventable. I think sometimes we get blinded in our search for cure. It's really, really hard to cure something when we don't know its primary causes. And it can be sometimes really, really straightforward to cure diseases such as stomach ulcers. When we found out stomach ulcers were not due to stress, but due to a bacteria, we rarely came up with a new treatment for stomach ulcers, and very few people die from bleeding ulcers today, whereas thousands, if not millions, did in generations in the past. So these are some of the recommendations that I have if you're really focused on Parkinson's and share the same passion that I do for it. There's a global grassroots organization called the PD Avengers. It's free to join. They have, I think, over 6,000 members from nearly 100 different countries. You can also sign up for our newsletter, which is free to do so. You can do so right now on your phone. And then we need political action to change this. I can't think of any good reason why China is banning pesticides that the United States are still permitting, and still permitting an increasing number. Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, whose father died from Parkinson's, has introduced a bill that would ban paraquat. You should consider telling your representatives and senators to sign on efforts to do that. The EPA recently proposed banning perchloroethylene from commercial uses, including phasing it out of use in dry cleaning. It's still widely used as a dry cleaner today. My guess is if you're dry cleaning up your clothes, you're still getting those clothes dry cleaned with this chemical that's a probable carcinogen and likely contributes to the rise of Parkinson's disease. If you haven't read our nice book on ending Parkinson's, it's, I think, well written. It's readily accessible. For any reason you can't afford it, we're happy to provide a copy for you for free. You can just email us at info@endingpd.org, info@endingpd.org. And similarly, we'd love to hear stories from you about your experiences with any of these chemicals, because that's how we learn a lot. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions that you and Dr. Dodick have. Thanks very much.
Wow, Dr. Dorsey, that was both spectacular and sobering, I must say. Just an astonishing presentation. Thank you. There are a number of questions already in the chat here. But maybe I'll ask you the first question. You mentioned Senator Cory Booker, but this has the makings of a congressional hearing. What else is being done to lobby policymakers to, given that it's so widely known, paraquat and TCE and the damaging effects that they can have and the potential causal nature for Parkinson's disease, what is being done?
Well, I don't think enough is being done. To the Michael J. Fox Foundation's credit, they introduced a bill that would create a national plan to end Parkinson's disease. It has a wide number of bipartisan support in the House and the Senate. Your listeners can all tell their representatives to sign on to endorse it. It would require the Department of Health and Human Services to develop a national action plan to address Parkinson's, including with a focus on preventing the disease. If you look at NIH funding for Parkinson's disease, it's about 250 million. HIV, which affects roughly the same number of people as Parkinson's disease, gets about 10 times that amount. Medicare spends $25 billion. So it spends 100 times more. So for each dollar that Medicare is spending on caring for people with Parkinson's disease, the NIH is spending 1 cent on research related to it. That's just not going to get the job done. If we don't change the course of it, as you indicated, the number of people with Parkinson's will double. 200 Americans were diagnosed with the disease today. 100 will die from the disease today. It's the world's fastest growing brain disease, and we're not treating it as such.
A couple of questions here about the amount of exposure to trichloroethylene that causes PD and cancer. So for those who might have been exposed, what is the dose and duration of exposure? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, it'd be great if I could give you a great answer. There, as I told you, only 2 cents of every Parkinson's research dollar goes on preventing the disease. The world's literature on trichloroethylene and Parkinson's disease is less than 30 articles. The world's literature on Parkinson's disease and trichloroethylene is less than 30 articles. I think that's about 10% of the articles that Dr. Dodick has published in his career as a single investigator. So we don't know. I suspect that there is a dose duration response. So one question that often comes up is, I'm a farmer, I work with pesticides, or I work with these chemicals. Why don't all people get these diseases? So there have to be other factors that explain, for example, why only 10% of smokers get the disease. Some of those factors are genetic, some are likely environmental, some are related to the dose of exposure, some are likely related to the duration of exposure, and I think some is related to the timing of exposure. And I think for many of these exposures, that early childhood, including in utero exposure, pesticides can cross the placental barrier. Tiny air pollutants, particulate matter, can cross the placenta. Pesticides are found in breast milk of nursing women. These things, the timing of exposure might be really important. We highlighted in one of our recent papers that the NBA basketball player, Brian Grant, a great champion for Parkinson's disease, was a 3-year-old boy at Camp Lejeune during the time of a contamination when his father was a Marine there. His father died of cancer, esophageal cancer tied to TCE. He 30 years later developed Parkinson's disease. So I think dose, duration, timing of exposure, and other factors likely explain who gets the disease and who doesn't.
The comment here, I live in the Napa Valley. People love the wine from this country. Cancer is prevalent here, as is Parkinson's disease. I so wish we could find a way to include this information in every doctor's materials, which are distributed in medical waiting rooms. And, another comment is someone with a background in neurobiology had no idea of the connection here. So why is this so relatively unknown, even amongst the neurological community, I would say, let alone other types of physicians?
Yeah, so first your Silicon Valley. So if you look on page 90 of our book is a map of Silicon Valley. So TCE was widely used to clean off silicon wafers in the 1970s and 80s. So on a 7-mile stretch of the 101 freeway in Silicon Valley are 15 TCE contaminated Superfund sites, which are likely contributing to the rise of cancer and Parkinson's disease in Silicon Valley. In the 1960s, a really smart physicist, Thomas Kuhn, was a physicist, and he was at Harvard. He wanted to shift his focus. He became less interested in physics and became more interested in the history of science. Harvard said, that's all very nice and interesting. You're not getting tenure. So he left Harvard and he went to Berkeley, which was more receptive to his radical ideas. And he wrote The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And he said in that book, which became the most cited book in the history of science, that scientists look at questions from defined paradigms. So he was, as a physicist, was really interested in what led to this shift from an Earth-centric model of the universe to a heliocentric, sun-centric view of the universe. And he said that required a paradigm shift. It required new tools, new ways of thinking. And the words of Max Planck, it also required the old guard to die off. And I think what we've been looking at in medicine for the last 20 or 30 years is genetic answers to diseases. And those are really, really important for some causes of headache, as Dr. Dodick can attest to. It's really, really important for rare neurological diseases like Huntington's disease, spinocerebellar ataxias, but almost all the diseases that are principally determined by genetic factors are rare. And that makes sense. If they were really common, they would have been weeded out over time through natural selection. And I think the most common diseases that we have in the world today, heart disease, cancer, COPD, Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, these are principally determined by environmental factors. There's some rare genetic causes, and sure, there are some genetic factors which likely modulate the effects. ApoE and air pollution have a known interaction, for example. But I think we're looking to solve these diseases with the wrong paradigm. We're trying to look at for genetic causes of disease. We're trying to seek to cure diseases when we don't adequately know the causes of the disease. If we shift our paradigm, I think we're going to make a lot more progress than we currently are.
Yeah. Ray, you touched on the role of particulate air pollution and perhaps other neurotoxins with regard to the Alzheimer's disease. And there's a question here about progressive white matter disease. And so can you speak to us about the role of these environmental toxins and air pollution and other neurodegenerative diseases as well?
Yeah, so there's this great research done by Dr. Lilian Calderon Garcia-Duenas, who's at the University of Montana and was a child prodigy. She was from Mexico, and she went to medical school at age 16. So she's a female Doogie Howser in Mexico City, which in the early 90s had the worst air pollution in the entire world. And she was concerned about the effects of air pollution on people's brains. And so she did a really clever study, maybe disturbing, is that she looked at the brains of children and young adults who died from either gun violence or car accidents in Mexico City. And she looked at the brains of 203 of these individuals who were age 40 all the way down to 11 months of age. And in 202 of the 203 brains, she found evidence of Alzheimer's pathology. She finds Alzheimer's pathology in 99% of brains of people as young as 11 months old who obviously didn't have Alzheimer's disease, but had the seeds of it. And she finds it a lot of it in the olfactory epithelium, and other people have found it in the olfactory bulb, which is a near universal finding for both Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease is pathology in the smell center of the brain. And we know that over 80% of people with these diseases lose their sense of smell. We also know that that's one of the earliest features of the disease, and that feature often precedes the development of memory difficulties or tremor, for example, by years, if not decades. So I think we have increasing evidence from hers and other work showing that air pollution is a major factor, I think, in the rise of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and probably less so for Parkinson's.
Yeah. There's also questions here about autism and multiple sclerosis. Any environmental association there?
So pesticides, many of these pesticides are nerve toxins. There's one pesticide that the EPA did ban either a year ago or 2 years ago. It's called chlorpyrifos, was widely used on golf courses, widely used on fences, widely used on apples. And is estimated to have cost 25 million kids in New York City 17 million IQ points because it was sprayed inside the houses, I think in the Bronx in New York. And so I think these nerve toxins are really, really important factors for developmental delay. I alluded to the fact that the timing of exposure might be really important for when people develop it. I don't have a really good intuitive feel for multiple sclerosis, so I'll pass on that one. But I think for developmental disorders, for autism, for Alzheimer's disease, for ALS, for Parkinson's disease, we can really look to the environment for some of the principal reasons for these diseases.
You received a research fellowship from the American Brain Foundation and the American Academy of Neurology. Did that launch you in the direction of your research on Parkinson's disease and pollutants?
I don't think it got me into Parkinson's. I was already into Parkinson's, but I think it let me look at the world from this macro sense. Most of us and most researchers are reductionists. We learn more and more about less and less. I kind of like the issues that intersect with society, like these environmental factors. And so that gave me the freedom to investigate. One question I was interested in was funding for biomedical research. And it's funny, I was looking back at some of the research I published when I was young, and I think some of them might have been funded by the AAN, and that's how I got to this 2 cents of every Parkinson's research dollar being focused on prevention, because 60% of the United States is the largest funder of biomedical research in the world. 60% of funding for biomedical research comes from industry, pharmaceutical companies, and medical device companies, which not surprisingly are interested in developing new and better treatments for the disease. But they're really not interested in trying to prevent the disease. It's not that model is not supported by the economics. So it leads to who's going to be the champion for investigating research, funding research aimed at preventing diseases. And if you have fundamentally preventable diseases, we should be devoting a large portion of our funding, not 2 cents, to preventing preventable diseases.
Ray, there's a question here. I'm an Air Force retiree and have been exposed to TCE at several bases in my 28-year career. I was evaluated for Parkinson's disease 18 years after retirement. Does the VA recognize TCE as a cause of PD?
So for Camp Lejeune, they do. I don't think that does. So Senator Daschle, who's I'm very fortunate to be friends with, in the 1980s, he served during the Vietnam War, and he was instrumental to getting Agent Orange covered as a cause of Parkinson's disease. I don't think that the VA looks at TCE, but your story is really, really, really concerning. Senator Johnny Isakson, who some of you know, passed away. He's the reason we had 2 elections for Georgia, about 4 years ago, is because he had Parkinson's disease and he stepped down and retired early. And he had Parkinson's disease. He also had renal cell carcinoma. And also it turned out that he served in the Georgia Air National Guard, and he served at bases in Georgia that were likely contaminated with TCE. So your story is not uncommon, unfortunately. It's very concerning. If you shoot me a little note at info@endingpd.org, info@endingpd.org, I'd be happy to provide you. I'd love to hear your story and provide you any guidance or suggestions that I can on your case.
It's a tough question here, but how do you change the paradigm to make it costly for companies making such toxic products unprofitable?
People have got to make their voices heard. I alluded to that HIV activists. They overtook a pharmaceutical company. I think it was Wellcome. They overtook the pharmaceutical company after it developed a drug to treat HIV. So think about that. The HIV activists were unhappy with the pharmaceutical company that developed a new treatment for it because they priced it too high. Right now, I've heard nothing, almost nothing from the Parkinson's community targeting the company that's manufacturing Paraquat when we have evidence that from a reputable newspaper that they knew about the risk for 50 years and let them get away with it. If we let people get away with it, they're only getting emboldened. They're only going to push the envelope more. It's not a hard calculus to do. I don't know why we researchers, why we in the neurology community are letting our fellow neuroscientists be targeted by companies. I think that's a discredit on us. It's a shame, a stain on us. And I don't know why people with Parkinson's disease and their friends and family members aren't getting upset and targeting these companies and not allowing them to get away with continued use, increasing use of this pesticide on farms near them when the company, according to The Guardian, knows about its toxic effects.
Yeah. Any relationship to Lewy body disease, given that it's a somewhat related disease?
Yeah, so there's a really smart Danish researcher called Per Borghammer, and he's been trying to map out, does Parkinson's disease begin in the nose or brain first, or does it begin in the gut first? And if you think about it, almost all these things, air pollution, pesticides, and TCE are all inhaled. So I think for Parkinson's disease, that I think nose is really the first port of entry. And he thinks about 2/3 of Parkinson's disease is brain first. And I'd say nose first, but brain first. And he thinks, conversely, 1/3 is gut first, or maybe systemic, because you can get skin exposure. He thinks for diffuse Lewy body disease, it might be the other way around. It's 2/3 beginning in the gut first and 1/3 in the brain. And so it could be indeed that case. You can imagine that pesticides contaminate groundwater, and some people might be getting their exposure through drinking groundwater and not necessarily through breathing it in. So I think there's more research to be done, but I wouldn't be surprised. I might know much less about Lewy body disease and Parkinson's, but I wouldn't be surprised if these same environmental factors are driving both diseases, and I think also contributing to other Parkinsonian disorders.
The question here, what can you tell us about the development of therapies for Parkinson's disease?
not been a good generation. So we've had no major therapeutic breakthroughs for Parkinson's in this century. And I think because we're not looking at it from the right paradigm. It's really, 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 really hard to make big therapeutic breakthroughs when you don't know the cause of a disease. When we figured out what caused HIV, we got new treatments for HIV. When we figured out what caused pulmonary ulcer disease, we got new treatments. When we used to think that tuberculosis was inherited. When we figured out it was due to bacteria, we got better treatments. When you figure out what causes the disease, it's much, much easier to develop new treatments. And I also think that for people with the disease, by the time someone's diagnosed with Parkinson's, 60% of the nerve cells have died off. I would be adamant about minimizing my exposure to these toxicants. I would be really concerned about air pollution exposure. I'd be really concerned about pesticide exposure. I'd be really concerned about the quality of the water I drink if I have these diseases. I think there are some low-hanging fruits for ways people can prevent further deterioration of that. Water filters, air filters, buying organic, washing your fruits and vegetables with water and a pesticide wash. There are tons of things that we can be doing that we're really not emphasizing to people.
Yeah, that brings us to this question is, what do you do to keep yourself as healthy as possible, knowing what you know about the environmental toxins?
This may come across wrong. I actually take heart in knowing what causes diseases, because I think I, as a highly educated, wealthy physician, can take a lot of proactive steps to preventing decreasing my likelihood of developing disease. So I exercise every day. I'm biking home today. I wear a helmet. I buy organic. I wash all my fruits and vegetables, even organic ones, with water and a pesticide wash. I add a carbon filter, water filter like Brita or Pure to my drinking water. So I think there's tons of things that we can do. If I had a well, I'd have my well water tested. About 40 million Americans, 1 in 8 Americans get their water from a well. I was concerned because I used to live in a high rise in Philadelphia. About 25% of doctors in the US are trained in Philadelphia. And like Philadelphia, New York, they have high rises, and on the bottom floor of these high rises are dry cleaners. And it turns out in apartments in New York, above those dry cleaners, you can find these chemicals in the indoor air of apartments above dry cleaners. And because TC and PC are fat soluble, you can find them in the butter and cheese in your refrigerator. We used to live in a high rise that was above a dry cleaner, and I got worried that the chemical can also cause congenital heart disease. One of my sons had congenital heart disease. It turned out that likely that that dry cleaner was only a storefront, so they weren't doing the dry cleaning on site. But I was really concerned that here I was, a medical student, perhaps breathing in these chemicals. And this TCE, I'm a little crazy, as you probably gather, but I think it could be the most important cause of Parkinson's disease in the United States. And almost no one knows. We know very little bit about it. Almost no one's doing anything about it.
There's from Hetty, who knows you, Ray, says, Ray, my Parkinson care partners are trying by calling our senators, etc. We talk it up every which way. I have 191 on my list for our group, Parkinson's Network North. So there are people who are fighting the good fight and doing everything they can by the looks of it. Yeah, listen, Michael J. Fox has been fighting the fight, and it just can't be 191. It's got to be 191,000. It's got to be 19.1 million. And that's what's happened. I mean, that's what happened with the March of Dimes. Literally, the dimes flooded the White House mailroom. Now it's illegal to mail dimes to the White House because they got so many dimes. The HIV activists, put a quilt on the National Mall and changed the entire dialogue about HIV in a relatively short period of time. The Parkies who are doing this great work are doing exactly what we need to be doing. We just need to amp this up 100-fold, 1,000-fold. And we can create a world where Parkinson's disease is increasingly rare. What a gift to give to future generations. What a gift to give to future generations, a world that's largely devoid of Parkinson's disease. Yeah. Yeah. As I started out this evening, Ray, I talked about the American Brain Foundation and how we have this mantra of cure one, cure many, because many brain diseases have underlying mechanisms that are shared. And so one of the reasons we're funding this Lewy body dementia project is if we found a diagnostic biomarker for Lewy body dementia, it might have a ripple effect in other neurodegenerative diseases as well. So one of the questions is, what should we be doing at the American Brain Foundation, at the American Academy of Neurology, to launch a project? Because right now we've launched one on neuroinflammation, because neuroinflammation is very common for many neurological diseases, but this is too. And so it sounds to me like we should be thinking seriously about launching a major research project that covers environmental toxins across neurological diseases.
Yeah, so I would start a campaign that says prevent one, prevent many. I don't want to be cured of Parkinson's disease. I don't want to get it.
Yeah.
And I think we're missing the greatest opportunity ever, which is to not be injured in a drunk driving accident, to not get polio, to not get HIV. And those individuals, I especially think about the mothers with drunk driving. I mean, they suffered unspeakable harm and unspeakable tragedy. And they didn't say we need better ambulances and better spinal cord injury rehab and better trauma centers. They said we need to stop drinking and driving. And we need to address the root cause of the disease. And I think, I could be wrong, but I think air pollution, I think certain pesticides, and I think these dry cleaning chemicals are the roots of a lot of Parkinson's disease. And I think at a place of a huge amount with Alzheimer's disease, I think these chemicals are also playing a huge role with ALS. As one of the earlier questions, I think they're playing a huge role for developmental diseases, and no one's funding it, no one's paying attention to it. So let's prevent one, let's prevent many. Let's create a world that's largely free of brain diseases. Let's make brain diseases no longer the greatest source of disability in the world. Let some other disease group have that distinction. Let us all live longer and healthier and more independent lives.
Absolutely. You better copyright that prevent one, prevent many. Right? I see my executive director here and the bells are going off.
You're welcome to it. I would be delighted to see it.
Last question, because we still get a lot of questions coming in here. And I guess as a call to action, this person says, I'm an elected representative in California and a past president of the California County Boards of Education. What can I do to make the biggest difference?
So California is leading the way. California is going to, I think, ban PCE, perchloroethylene. California, I'll give you a story. So in the 1950s and 60s, people were wearing masks, not because of COVID, but they were wearing masks because of air pollution in California. And the face of that, the governor of California in the 1960s said, we need to eliminate all unnecessary driving, passed some of the strictest air quality measures in the state of California. And those measures have largely been adopted in the rest of the country. People in Southern California breathe cleaner air, have less dementia, less Parkinson's disease, less respiratory disease, less cancer, because of these stricter air policies. The governor who passed who made that statement about eliminating all necessary driving was Ronald Reagan. If Ronald Reagan can see the benefits of clean air, I think all Americans can see the benefit of clean air. And we need to do exactly, if you're a person in California, we should do exactly what California has always done, led the nation on addressing the environmental toxicants in our atmosphere and our environment. The more this is widely popular, like everyone gets the idea that that air pollution is bad. Everyone gets the idea that dirty water, whether in Flint, Michigan, or anywhere else in the United States, is unhealthy. If we make this an issue for the whole country, we'll all live longer and healthier lives. And if we can do that in California, we can do that for the country. If we can do it for the country, we can do it for the rest of the world. I can't think of a better thing to do than get rid of Parkinson's specialists, just like we get rid of polio specialists, just like hopefully in the future we'll get rid of HIV specialists. Where we can all live lives largely free of these very fearful and very disabling and deadly brain diseases.
Dr. Dorsey, that was simply spectacular tonight. Can't thank you enough for being here. Like, bravo. It was inspiring. It was motivating. I know you've lit the fire under so many people, and I can't wait to spread this, because we recorded this tonight. So this recording is going to be spread wide and far, I can tell you. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Delighted to be with all of you.